While Donald Trump was threatening Canada with 35% tariffs and accusing Mexico of enabling drug trafficking across the border, something happened in October 2025 that nobody in Washington anticipated. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum quietly signed a bilateral economic agreement that could fundamentally restructure North American trade. And the centerpiece of that agreement is a plan that should terrify American logistics companies and port operators. Mexico is gaining direct access to Canadian maritime channels specifically designed to reduce dependence on existing U.S. trade routes. This isn't about diplomatic gestures or symbolic partnerships. This is about physical infrastructure being built right now to allow Mexican exports to reach global markets without crossing American territory or passing through American ports. By 2028, according to leaked planning documents, a new North Belt corridor will connect Mexican manufacturing centers directly to Canadian ports on the Pacific and Atlantic coasts, bypassing the United States entirely. And the economic consequences for American infrastructure could exceed $125 billion over the next decade. Here's what makes this moment unprecedented. For 75 years, North American trade has operated under one fundamental assumption that goods moving between Canada and Mexico would flow through the United States. Geography, infrastructure, and decades of integrated supply chains meant that American ports, American rail networks, and American trucking companies were unavoidable middlemen in continental commerce. That dependence translated into enormous economic benefits for the United States. Logistics fees, port revenues, customs processing, warehousing, transportation contracts, billions of dollars annually flowing to American companies simply because Canada and Mexico had no practical alternative to routing their trade through U.S. territory. That economic reality is about to change. According to the bilateral agreement signed by Carney and Sheinbaum, Mexico is establishing what officials are calling alternative trade corridors that provide direct Canadian port access. The language is diplomatic, but the intent is clear. Build infrastructure that allows Mexico to trade with Asia, Europe, and Latin America without depending on American cooperation. And Canada, facing its own concerns about Trump's unpredictable tariff policies and threats of economic coercion, has every incentive to help Mexico succeed. Because what weakens American leverage over Mexico also weakens American leverage over Canada. This is strategic cooperation with one goal: reduce vulnerability to Washington's economic threats by creating alternatives that don't require American permission. Let's talk about what's actually in this agreement because the details reveal how serious both countries are about reducing American influence over their trade. The bilateral partnership signed in October 2025 identifies several specific areas of collaboration that go far beyond typical diplomatic statements. First, Mexico is pursuing what the agreement calls diverse and resilient supply chains via Canada. That's diplomatic language for reducing dependence on American manufacturing inputs and logistics networks. Second, and this is the part that threatens American infrastructure most directly, Mexico wants direct access to Canadian ports. The agreement explicitly states that this access would make Mexico less dependent on existing U.S. maritime channels. Think about what that means for American port operators in Los Angeles, Long Beach, Houston, and the Gulf Coast. Those facilities have been the primary gateways for Mexican exports heading to Asia and Europe. If Mexican goods can be transported overland to Canadian ports in Vancouver, Prince Rupert, or Halifax and shipped directly to international markets from there, American ports lose billions in revenue. The scale of the existing economic relationship makes this shift even more significant. Bilateral trade between Canada and Mexico totaled $56 billion in 2024. Canada's total foreign direct investment in Mexico reached $46 billion. Mexico is Canada's third largest trading partner, and Canada is Mexico's fifth largest. These aren't minor economic relationships. These are massive trade flows that currently move through infrastructure that touches American territory at multiple points. The agreement also addresses joint production targeting Latin American and Asian markets, specifically taking advantage of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Both Canada and Mexico are signatories to the TPP, which the United States withdrew from in 2017. That gives them preferential access to markets across Asia that American exporters don't automatically enjoy. By coordinating production and utilizing Canadian ports for Asian exports, Mexico can leverage TPP benefits while avoiding American trade barriers. And here's the detail that reveals the strategic thinking behind this partnership. The agreement includes provisions for enhanced security cooperation to combat synthetic opioid trafficking and social integration of migrant workers. These are the exact issues Trump has used to justify tariffs against both countries. By addressing those concerns bilaterally, Canada and Mexico are removing Trump's primary justification for economic coercion while simultaneously building infrastructure that makes them less vulnerable to American pressure. The message to Washington is clear. You can't threaten us into compliance if we have alternatives that don't require your cooperation. Now, here's where this stops being a trade story and becomes a fundamental crisis for American economic strategy in North America. The United States has spent the entire post World War II era building what economists call hub and spoke integration. The concept is straightforward: position America at the center of North American commerce so that trade between Canada and Mexico flows through American territory, American infrastructure, and American regulatory systems. That geography created enormous strategic advantages for Washington. When American presidents wanted to pressure Canada or Mexico on immigration, drug enforcement, labor standards, or environmental policy, they could threaten to disrupt the trade flows that both countries depended on. And because those flows moved through American ports, American rail networks, and American customs facilities, the threats were credible. Canada and Mexico would eventually negotiate because they had no practical alternative to American cooperation. But hub and spoke integration only works if the hub remains indispensable. And the Canada Mexico bilateral agreement is specifically designed to make the United States dispensable. According to analysis from trade policy experts, the North Belt Corridor Plan represents the first serious attempt to create north-south trade infrastructure in North America that doesn't depend on American participation. The corridor would connect Mexican manufacturing centers in the central and northern states directly to Canadian rail networks, which then provide access to Pacific ports like Vancouver and Prince Rupert for Asian trade, and Atlantic ports like Halifax for European trade. Mexican goods would cross one border into Canada and then ship internationally without ever touching American territory. That's not theoretical diversification. That's physical infrastructure designed to eliminate American leverage. And here's the part that should concern American strategists most. This infrastructure is being built during a period of maximum American unreliability. Trump's tariff threats, his suggestions that Canada should become the 51st state, his accusations that Mexico enables drug trafficking and illegal immigration, all of that rhetoric has convinced leaders in both countries that the United States is no longer a trustworthy partner. According to leaked diplomatic communications reported by multiple outlets, Canadian and Mexican officials privately described Trump's approach as economic blackmail, and their response isn't to capitulate. Their response is to build alternatives that make American blackmail ineffective. Once that infrastructure exists, once Mexican exporters have established shipping relationships through Canadian ports, once supply chains are reconfigured to avoid American territory, those changes become permanent features of the North American economy. So let's talk about what this actually means for American economic power in North America, because the consequences extend far beyond port revenues and logistics fees. For 75 years, the United States has been able to conduct trade policy with Canada and Mexico under one massive structural advantage: geographic centrality. Goods moving between the two countries had to pass through American territory or utilize American infrastructure because there was no practical alternative. That meant Washington could set terms, impose conditions, and threaten economic disruption, knowing that both neighbors would eventually comply because they had nowhere else to go. That advantage is disappearing. And it's disappearing because Trump's own policies demonstrated to Canada and Mexico that depending on American goodwill is strategically dangerous. According to economic analysis cited in reporting on the bilateral agreement, the North Belt Corridor and associated infrastructure projects could cost the United States approximately $125 billion over the next decade. That figure includes lost port revenues, reduced logistics contracts, decreased customs processing fees, and diminished leverage in future trade negotiations. But the strategic cost is even higher than the economic calculation suggests, because once Canada and Mexico successfully establish direct trade corridors that bypass the United States, other countries will notice. If two of America's closest neighbors can reduce their economic dependence on Washington by building alternative infrastructure, why can't other countries do the same? The precedent matters enormously. Here's where the numbers get even more concerning for American interests. Canadian ports on the Pacific coast, particularly Vancouver and Prince Rupert, already handle significant container traffic heading to Asia, but they've been operating well below capacity because most North American exports to Asia still flow through American ports in California and the Pacific Northwest. If Mexican goods start routing through Canadian ports via the North Belt corridor, those facilities will need to expand rapidly to handle increased volume. And that expansion represents permanent infrastructure investment that locks in the new trade patterns. Port facilities, rail connections, warehousing complexes, customs processing centers. Once that infrastructure exists and is optimized for Mexican traffic, it doesn't get abandoned just because Trump leaves office or American trade policy becomes more predictable. But there's an even deeper problem that goes beyond infrastructure and trade flows. The Canada Mexico bilateral agreement includes provisions for joint production targeting Latin American and Asian markets through the Trans Pacific Partnership. Both countries are TPP members. The United States is not, having withdrawn in 2017. That means Canadian and Mexican companies can collaborate on manufacturing projects that access Asian markets with preferential terms that American competitors don't receive. Trump's decision to withdraw from TPP was supposed to protect American manufacturing. Instead, it created an opening for America's neighbors to build integrated supply chains that exclude the United States entirely. And now they're doing exactly that, with infrastructure designed to make American participation unnecessary. So, where does this go from here? The immediate test comes in July 2026, when the United States, Canada, and Mexico are scheduled to conduct the mandatory review of CUSMA. According to statements from both Canadian and Mexican officials, the bilateral agreement signed in October 2025 was explicitly timed to strengthen their negotiating position heading into those talks. The message to Washington is straightforward. You can threaten us with tariffs, but we're building alternatives that make your threats less effective. And if the CUSMA review results in the United States imposing conditions that Canada and Mexico find unacceptable, they now have infrastructure plans that allow them to walk away from American-centered trade integration. The North Belt Corridor construction timeline provides a clear deadline for when this alternative infrastructure becomes operational. According to planning documents, the corridor is scheduled for completion by 2028. That's only 2 years after the CUSMA review. If negotiations with the United States fail or produce unsatisfactory results, Canada and Mexico will have a functioning alternative ready within 24 months. That's not a long-term contingency plan. That's an immediate backup option that changes the entire calculation of leverage in North American trade negotiations.